It's time to find out
What Shane said
with Shane Manila.
Hey world, it's time to discuss Hammer running backs. Last week, or about 2 weeks ago probably at this point, we discussed Hammer wide receivers and Hammer quarterbacks. Just like I did with that scoring, the scoring I'm going to use is based off of FF Spaceman's database. Hopefully he does it for 2024. I don't think he plans to, but hopefully if he's watching this, or if anyone that's a patron of his is watching this, we can convince him to, because it's a great database. But anyway, that's what I'm using. And just like with that information, or that data, I should say, it counts the first 16 games of a player's season. Week 17, or their 17th game, I should say, is not included because the 17th game of the season for those players might not have mattered, or they might not have played. All right, enough preamble. Let's get to it. Before I start talking Hammer running backs, though, I did want to note some interesting things that I found while I was going through this. Running backs 14 through 27. There was a giant cluster of running backs in this range. These running backs 14 through 27, were separated by a grand total of 2.2 fantasy points. Ramondre Stevenson through Jonathan Taylor. There's all types of running backs in this range. You got your James Conner, your James Cook, your Josh Jacobs. I promise they weren't all J's. Also, Bijan Robinson, Kenny Taylor, Brian Robinson's. Well, just one Brian Robinson. Austin Eckler, Jerome Ford, Tony Pollard, Zach Moss, DeAndre Swift, among a couple other players. What's interesting about this is these are all types of running backs, right? These are running backs that, like Bijan Robinson, were expected to be high-end running back ones that weren't. Again, these are running back 2s through running back 3s, high running back 3s. What the main takeaway from this, though, is running back production in this range is replaceable. If anyone is offering you a first-round draft pick for most of these running backs, take it and run. When we talk about process trades, when we talk about moving, I don't know, let's say a John Taylor for a Tony Pollard in a first, this is what we're talking about, and this is why we're talking about making deals like this. Now, obviously, we're not saying move Bijan Robinson for Tony Pollard in the first, because we expect a lot more out of Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson, this was his rookie year. There were some mitigating factors, Arthur Smith namely being that mitigating factor that we expect to be better now that for Bijan Robinson in year 2. But again, when we talk about replaceability at running back, this is what we're talking about. The fact that the RB14, RB27, giant cluster of running backs separated by 2.2 fantasy points. So there's no reason to be paying for the name there when the production is similar. Then the RB6 through RB13 separated by 1.7 fantasy points. This is 8 running backs in that range. This fantasy production is a little more, obviously, high-end, a little less replaceable, but still, I don't want to say easy to find, but you can still find it. The names in this range include Travis Etienne, Gibbs, Breece Hall, Rashad White, Saquon Barkley, Isaiah Pacheco, David Montgomery, and Joe Mixon. It's a good mix of running backs, right? You got some old guys like Joe Mixon and Barkley, younger dudes like Hall and Jahmyr Gibbs. And then we've got the super elite. It's a pretty mixed bag. Some of these dudes you'd expect, and some dudes not so much. You got Christian McCaffrey, Kyren Williams, Alvin Kamara, Raheem Mostert, and Devon Achane. Very, 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 very interesting mix. But we'll get to those. Some of those dudes are, no doubt about it, hammers. Some are dudes that I think are hammers that probably other people don't. And a couple of those dudes I don't think are hammers. So let's get to it. I guess one easy way of discerning or determining who a hammer is this a running back you would give up a first for in the offseason? Is this a running back you would give up multiple firsts for in the offseason? And again, I'm not talking about in season, right? Because there's lots of things we would do in season that we wouldn't do in the off season. In season, you're doing whatever you need to do to survive. It's just like prison. When you're in prison, you do what you need to do to survive, and I'm not going to judge you for that. Whatever a man or woman needs to do to get through the next day in jail, you do it. Same in season. You're trying to win a title. I get it. But in the off season, you're not just trying to survive to get to the next day. You're thinking long term. So you shouldn't be just making deals like that to get through the next day. You should be thinking long term. You shouldn't be giving up first just because. So there should be a very finite number of running backs that you'd be willing to give up running backs. So one of the things I wanted to look at was spike weeks, because that's what I looked at when we were looking at the other positions, quarterback and wide receivers. So I looked at spike weeks at 25 points per week, 25-point games, when I was looking at quarterbacks and wide receivers. So for running backs, I did the same thing. But when I did that, I only found 53 instances. There was only 53 times last year where a running back had 25-point plus games. And that averaged only 3.3 per week. That felt low. And quite frankly, when something is that small, I don't know that it's a good barometer to use. So what I did is, and I went to Twitter and asked Twitter's permission. I asked Twitter if they thought 20 points per week is a good barometer for a spike week. Twitter said yes by an 84% to 15% margin. No, that doesn't equal 100, but I'm not adding in the decimal points. Well, forget it. I will. 84.3% of the respondents said yes. 15.7% of respondents said no. So I went with 20 point weeks as being the spike week. That gave us 126, which is an average of 7.9 per week. So 7.9 times per week, a running back scored at least 20 points per week. So that's what we used as a spike week. I will mention 25-point weeks, though, because they're fun. So that's what I'm using as my spike week. And now I'm just going to jump right into who the hammers are. Right off the bat, I don't think this is a surprise. You got Christian McCaffrey. In 2023, he led running backs in top 5 weeks in both raw numbers, 9, and in percentage in games played with 56%. He also led in 25-plus point weeks with 6. He was the running back 1 overall, and he had 12 20-point weeks. 20 points at least 75% of the times, 25 points at least 6%, 6 games, and he was a top 5 running back 9 times. He's played 5 full seasons. He was a running back 1 twice and a running back 2 twice. So yeah. He's a hammer. Next up, I got Jahmyr Gibbs. He's a little lower than maybe in points per game than maybe you would expect for a hammer. He finished as the running back 7th overall. He was 8th in fantasy points per opportunity. But he did have 6 20-plus point weeks, which tied for 3rd most. And he did that in only 14 games. So 43% of the games that he played in were spike weeks. He also tied for 3rd most 25-point-plus weeks. Again, even though he only played in 14 games. He was tied for 2nd in he had the 2nd most top 5 scoring weeks with 6, which was the 3rd highest by percentage. So 43% of the time he was a top 5 scoring running back. So he's a hammer to me. Breece Hall. I don't do rankings. If I did, Breece Hall would be my running back 1. Breece Hall. I think the dude is going to be an absolute monster in 2024 and 2025, and that's about as long as I'm willing to bet on any running back, and that is a stretch for me. So he tied for 3rd in spike weeks. He scored at least 20 points in 6 of his 16 games. He also tied for 2nd with most 25-point-plus games. He had 4. He had 4 25-point-plus games. He was 4th in top 5 scoring weeks. He had 5. 31% of his games were top 5 scoring games. Now, what is especially impressive about this is Breece Hall was on a pitch count for the first 4 weeks. And I went back and looked that up to see what did that actually mean. What that meant was Breece Hall, through the first 4 weeks, averaged 10.5 opportunities per game. And an opportunity, or opportunities per game, I should say, is targets plus rushing attempts. 10.5 opportunities per game through the first 4 weeks. Still averaged 11.5 points per game. Not bad. So he averaged about 11.3 fantasy points per game during the first 4 weeks. During the next 12 games, when the pitch count was off, he averaged 19.3 fantasy points per game, which would have been the running back 3 overall over a full season. It's a pretty good stretch. That's not one of those little 4-game samples where we go, oh, if you extrapolate that over a full year. I hate when people do that. 12-game stretch is pretty significant. Now, he also did that on an offense, which was, the technical term is atrocious, awful, bad. I think the offense will be better. Can't be worse. Even if it just improves to mediocre, it should be better. It's going to be a better offense. I really can't wait to see what Breece Hall does without a pitch count. All right. Fourth hammer, that's how math works, if you go in order by numbers, is Bijan Robinson. Talked about him earlier. He was in the running back 2 or 3 range. I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't remember. But he was in that big clump of 14 running backs, all separated by 2.2 fantasy points. So he wasn't special, is the point. This is all supposition, all I don't want to say make-believe, but this is all based off of the prospect that he was in college. We saw a couple flashes last year, but we definitely did not see it in the pros. He only had 1 top 5 week last year. He only had 3 20-point weeks last year. He lost way too much work to Tyler Algier. I'm going to blame Arthur Smith, but again, this is all supposition. We haven't actually seen it yet, but he is valued like a hammer, and we think he is going to be a hammer. Now, if he comes out in 2024 and he does not do hammer things, then the bottom's probably going to fall out on his value, and he will not be valued as a hammer. So, if someone were to offer me a package, pick players that was commiserate with the value that they would offer for, let's say, Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, or Breece Hall, for Bijan Robinson, if he was on my roster, there's a pretty good chance I would take it. That's some actionable advice, because I don't think I've given much right now so far, other than don't overpay for the running backs in that first tier that we talked about, that big old cluster. And we'll get back to that again. But yeah, if someone were to offer me, like I said, something along the lines of what they would offer me for Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, or Breece Hall for Bijan Robinson, I would probably take it and be out. Yeah. So next up, probably my most controversial hammer, Devon Achane. Look, my love for Devon Achane is well known. So I'm just going to go right into it. It's not based off just him being fun, though he is. And I'm not going to lie to you, likability plays a part in this. Tied for running back 4 in points per game last year, 17.8 points per game. First in points per opportunity. First in fantasy points per opportunity. Third in spike weeks by percentage of games played. 50% of the games he played in last year, he scored at least 20 points. He played 10 games last year, and in 5 of those, he scored at least 20 points. He's also tied for third with 25-point plus games with 3. He hit that mark in 30% of those games. In 40% of his games, he was a top 5 running back. 40% of his games. The dude is a spike week. Again, third in spike weeks by percentage. So in 5 of his games, he hit 20-plus points. He only played 10 games. I get that. I understand that. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later when I get to someone that's not a hammer. Devon Achane. He is a hammer to me. Again, I understand there's concerns about his injury history. He is a spike week. When I talk about hammers, I talk about and I think about dudes that have the ability to win you a week, or at least play a huge part in you winning a week. And that is Devon Achane. All right. Now we'll get to the folks that I don't have as being hammers, and the biggest omission right off the bat. I might as well get to it. Kyren Williams. I'll tell you the good things. I mean, he was the running back 2 last year. And again, that's through the first 16 games of his season. He ranked second with 7 20-plus point weeks. He was second with 4 25-point-plus weeks. He tied for second with 6 top 5 running back weeks. 50% of his games, he was at least a top 5 running back. So why Achane and not Williams? And Williams actually played more games than Devon Achane. He played 12 games as opposed to Devon Achane playing 10 in this data set. Achane played 11 overall, but his last game didn't count towards this data set. Well, this is my biggest concern. Williams' specific injuries, his foot and ankle. His foot injury, more specifically than anything. He broke his foot 2 years ago, Jones fracture. That foot is still not right. So much so that he's not practicing or did not practice in OTAs last week because the foot that he broke 2 years ago is bothering him. 2 years ago. He was 4th in opportunity share last year. The Rams went out and drafted a 3-down back in Blake Corum. Someone that's definitely going to cut into Kyren Williams' opportunity share, even if Kyren Williams were to remain healthy this year. I have absolutely no doubt that Kyren Williams will not remain healthy this year. He's already not healthy. He already is dealing with a foot injury to a foot that was broken 2 years ago. Now, again, this foot was broken 2 years ago, and it's still not healed now correctly because it's bothering him now. Blake Corum is going to eat into his workload. When Kyren Williams misses time, Blake Corum is good enough to steal significant work. And then when Kyren Williams returns, what is Kyren Williams returning to? Now, he will be the starter, I have no doubt, and he is very good. He was very efficient last year. But if he doesn't return to a 74% work share, let's say he returns to a 60% work share, is that going to be enough to make him a top 5 running back? I don't think so. I think he's more likely a top 8, top 10 running back, which is good, very good, but not a hammer. So I don't want you to take this to think that I don't like Kyren Williams. I think Kyren Williams is a very good running back. I think he's going to lose enough work to Blake Corum that unfortunately he's not going to be a top tier, top 4 running back. Okay. Again, Achane, injury history, I understand that. His injuries, a little more fluky, not as concentrated. And quite frankly, even if there's no way he's going to lose any opportunity share because his opportunity share, quite frankly, already sucks. It was at 40% last year, and it already ranked 41st. So unless he doesn't play at all, he's not losing opportunity share. So, yeah, Kyren Williams, unfortunately, doesn't make it for me. And I'm sure you're going to argue with me, and I am 100% open to debate on that one. I understand that one is debatable. The next one, Travis Etienne. Look, I went back and forth on Travis Etienne. At one point, he was on my list. Then he was off. Then he was on. Then he was off. I've settled on him being off. He was 6th in points per game. He did have 6 20-plus point fantasy point weeks last year. He did have 4 top 5 weeks. But he was 25th in fantasy points per opportunity in 2023. It wasn't a fluke either. He was 37th in fantasy points per opportunity in 2022. His fantasy scoring was bolstered. Let's use that. I know that's a word. By 12 touchdowns. It's kind of a judgment call. This feels like one that the rug could get pulled out on. He feels inefficient. It feels like the rug could get pulled out on him if he loses some work. What's most important regarding Travis Etienne, I think, is feel. Does he feel like a hammer to you? He does not feel like a hammer to me. Now, that doesn't mean that I would not like him on my roster. That does not mean that he's not a good arbitrage play. Got to use the word arbitrage. If I can get him for a late first, I think I'll do that. If I can get him for a 26 first, I definitely do that. But I don't think he's a hammer. Okay, Alvin Kamara, he's old. Yes, he was a running back 3 last year. But that was carried by 3 spike weeks. He had 3 games where he scored 27 points, over 27 points. Outside of that, he was good, not great. John Taylor, he's had 1 elite season. Outside of that, he's been the RB8, 12, and 17. Raheem Mostert, ton of touchdowns, old, 1-year breakout, and that happened to come in like his 13th year, give or take. And then Saquon Barkley, referred to John Taylor, very, very similar. It's very similar. So, again, my hammers, Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, Devon Achane. And again, going back to the first takeaway, RB14, RB2 through RB3, and really back-end RB1 production all the way through RB3 production, high-end RB3. Well, let's say back-end RB1 and back-end RB2 production, very replaceable. Do not overpay for it. All right. I thank you for watching another episode of Shane Says. Let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.